Hey guys, what's up? Welcome to this week's Q&A. As always, thank you so much for your questions. And also, as always, if I don't answer your question in this video, then you can go ahead and copy and paste it onto the bottom of this Patreon post, and I might answer it in the next one. And also, as always, don't forget to post any new questions that you have, as well as like all the questions that you want answered, because I generally answer them in order of how many likes they have. So let's jump right in. QuasarQuest asks, you said in a tweet that you removed the new video, the one about importing English words into Japanese, because you realized you weren't knowledgeable enough on the topic. What changed? What are the new arguments which you heard after making the video? Yeah, so a couple weeks ago I uploaded a video to my Matt vs. Japan channel called Why English Loanwords Are Ruining Japanese, parentheses, not for the reason that you think, or something like that. And it was actually a video that I created by taking a clip from one of these Patreon-only Q&A videos and kind of editing it up and making it more neat and tidy, and then putting it up on YouTube. And so fundamentally, I still agree with everything I said in that video, and I still kind of stand by my conclusion, but I just realized that I basically left out a lot of nuance that basically makes the argument look really sloppy if you just watch that video and you don't and you don't feel like giving me the benefit of the doubt, basically. So, I think it's fine for Q&A video where I'm just speaking off the cuff and, most of the people listening are already empathetic with my point of view. But yeah, there are just I just realized that to keep it up on my main YouTube channel, I would have wanted to basically go into a lot more detail and explain the topic with a lot more nuance. And now I'll go into some of the points where I particularly felt that way about. So first of all, in the video, I talk about how anytime you see a two kanji word in Japanese, that's pretty much just a Chinese word that's been borrowed into Japanese. But and although this is the case in the vast majority of cases, there's also some words that Japanese people made up themselves out of kanji, and some of those even got imported into Chinese. Like I think bunmei is one of those words where actually Japanese people made it up in the Meiji period, and then it got imported into China. So yeah, in the Meiji period, Japanese people made up a lot of new kanji words for concepts that were getting imported from the West. So, a lot of texts from the West were getting translated into Japanese, and at that time in the Meiji period, the most common way to handle words that didn't exist in Japanese was to actually make up a new kanji compound. And then a lot of those kanji compounds for scientific terms and things like that were created in the Meiji period got imported into Chinese. So yeah, there are exceptions to this general principle of whenever you see kanji words in Japanese, those are borrowed Chinese words, but I didn't cover that in detail. Or I didn't cover that at all in the video. And also, let me see, I have a list right here. Oh yeah, so another thing is that I basically said in the video, I talked about how a lot of I basically said in the video, Japanese people will use English words in place of Japanese words just because they want to sound cool. Now, this definitely happens a lot of the time, but there's also times where they import English loanwords for like a perfectly legitimate reason, right? Like, there's a lot more factors that go into why Japanese people actually import loanwords into Japanese. A lot of the time, it's just because someone, like for example, a Japanese speaker is just talking about maybe a book they read in English, and they don't want to just make up a new Japanese word that would feel weird to them, right? They're not a translator or anything, so they just say what the English word was in Japanese, but then other people hear that and it catches on. And so there's many other reasons why Japanese people might start using an English word, and I didn't really go into that. I only talked about the one case where, people are using it to sound cool. And I did that because when I was talking in the Q&A, I kind of assumed that the person asking the question was talking about that case, because if there's a legitimate reason for borrowing an English word, obviously there's no problem. It's the kind of rampant replacing of Japanese words with English words. But yeah, of course, there are also a lot of other reasons why English loanwords get imported, and a lot of those are totally legitimate, and I didn't talk about those. Another thing is that a lot of times, or almost in the majority of the cases actually, when there's a Japanese word for something and then Japanese people start using an English word for the same concept to like sound cool, it does have a different vibe and it sounds a little different. And a lot of times that difference is actually important, like like one of the examples actually used in the video was gijutsu versus technology, but those actually mean pretty different things. I think technology talks about like specifically tech, that like what we'd call tech in English, and like new tech products and better like actual like physical hardware and things like that, whereas gijutsu just kind of means like what like technology in English in the broadest sense of the word, of like you could say learning how to start a fire is like technology in a way, so there are distinctions in the way that these nuances distinctions in the nuances of these different words, and that can be significant, but I also didn't kind of really talk about that. Another thing is that I talk about in the video how a lot of the loan words are really long and clunky and hard to pronounce and awkward, but the majority of those get shortened to something that are easy to pronounce anyway. So, like smartphone is just smaho, and smaho is not hard to say or remember. Or like McDonald's is just shortened to like Maku or Makudo, depending on where you are in Japan. And so that also kind of nullifies the point of them being long and awkward to pronounce. And another just thing is that the way I talked about it in the video, I think a lot of people interpreted what I was saying as though I was assigning agency to this process. I was like, Japanese people are bad for borrowing so much English words, and they should stop doing that. But that wasn't what I meant to say at all, because I understand that language evolves very organically, and that without an excessive amount of coercion, it's almost impossible to really consciously shape the way that a language evolves. And so I wasn't really trying to say that, I wasn't trying to blame Japanese people and say they should do otherwise. I was just pointing out this is a trend that exists, and this is what I think the negative effects of that trend are. But a lot of people came at me with this like linguistic point of view of like, oh no, you can't criticize language change because language change is so natural and blah, 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 blah. But it's like, yeah, I get that, but I still think that there's some practical issues, mainly the main one about kanji, where if more and more English words displace kanji words, then the percentage of kanji words that make up modern Japanese is going to get smaller and smaller, yet it's going to take just as much time and effort for Japanese children to learn kanji. So that's going to start to make less and less sense. Now, maybe the answer is there's just going to be some inflection point where they decide, oh, okay, we're jettisoning kanji and now we're all kana, or maybe they'll come up with a new alphabet like Korean or something like that. And so maybe that will happen and then everything will be fine, because it seems like Korean is doing just fine with their new phonetic alphabet. Obviously, that will be a lot of culture that will be lost if you totally drop kanji, but who knows? Maybe that's what will happen one day. But another thing is that like there is kind of this general idea in linguistics that I do understand, which is that languages kind of have these internal balancing mechanisms in them. So if a certain shift in a language makes it so that it's kind of out of balance in one way, there will be some natural force that kind of like shifts something else to bring it back into balance. So that's, I think, why a lot of people were like saying, oh no, it's not going to ruin Japanese, because yeah, ultimately, if there are all these long loan words, then there's going to become a trend to shorten the loan words so that they get easier to say, or there's going to be a trend to go back to the Japanese words that are easier to pronounce, or something like this. So nothing that's actually that, problematic is going to persist for that long within any language that's actually used in day-to-day life. And so I get that. And I also just get that a lot of people were triggered by the fact that I use the word ruin and also that I use the word steal. And I was just trying to be provocative and clickbaity. And it worked. That video got a lot of views compared to, some of my other videos. But yeah, I just realized that I think it might give the wrong impression to some of the more, like basically people who actually care a lot about linguistics and know a lot about linguistics. I feel like some of those people might watch my video and think, oh, Matt's not very scrupulous about linguistics. He kind of doesn't take it seriously, and he has these kind of like unfounded takes that aren't based on science. And so that's why I didn't really feel good about having it up, even though fundamentally I still think my argument is true, where it's like, well, what's going to happen to kanji when you have, so many words that, like when you have fewer and fewer words that use kanji within Japanese. Well, I still think that the biggest conclusion of that video holds true. Just, yeah, I was lacking the nuance of all those other points. And also that, yeah, of course Japanese is going to be ruined. No language is going to ruin itself. That was just clickbait, guys. So, yeah, that is my thoughts on that. So Vulcan asks, I learned Spanish to stage 3 with immersion-based methods and transitioned to learning Japanese 3 months ago. I'll be working in Tokyo for a year starting May 2023. I used to watch a lot of anime with English subs, and nowadays I still listen to a lot of Japanese music. I wanted to hear your thoughts on the latent potential of a Japanese language learner in this position. For reference, I have 86 days, or 2016 hours, of anime logged, and more if you count music. To be honest, I wouldn't count music, but I did not plan on learning Japanese, so I didn't pay any special attention to the audio when I consumed this media. From my experience with Spanish, I know this was very low quality input, but the volume of input was substantial, and I have perceived some benefits when it comes to parsing sounds and learning common vocabulary. Do you think there are any other potential benefits, such as with pronunciation? For reference, I was 16 when I started watching anime, and I'm currently a beginner with 3,000 kanji from RRTK and 600 cards. So, yeah, my RRTK deck only has 1,000 cards, and maybe you made your own RRTK deck with 3,000 kanji. It's kind of weird. I wouldn't recommend that. But, yeah, I mean, really, well, my two main thoughts are, first of all, I don't know. Second of all, there's probably going to be a lot of individual difference. Like, I actually, when I was in high school, I knew this one girl. I might have told the story before. But there was a girl at my high school who was pretty much fluent in Japanese, and she learned just by watching anime with subs. Now, she had been watching anime with subs since she was in, like, elementary school, I think. So, you know, brain is still pretty supple when you're that young. So I think that might be part of it. And also, maybe she just had a natural tendency to kind of really listen to the audio and not just zone it out and pay attention to the English subs, because that happens to a lot of people. I'll also just say that at that point in time, I sucked at Japanese, so I couldn't really tell how good she was. So it could be that if I heard her now, I'd be like, oh, wow, yeah, you're pretty good. That's impressive. Or, oh, actually, you're not that good, but I was falling into the fluency illusion back then. So, yeah, I don't know if she was really, truly fluent or not, but still, she was definitely way better at Japanese than most anime fans who've just watched a shit ton of anime but haven't studied Japanese. So, yeah, there's people like that, and then there's other people who have watched, you know, thousands of hours of anime, yet have seemed to have picked up almost nothing. So that leads me to think that there's probably some individual difference. Like maybe some people naturally zone out the Japanese more and just look at the English subs, whereas other people aren't like that, and their brain actually does pay attention to those subs. So that's probably gonna depend. That's probably gonna change what your results are. But I also think that even if you're the type of person who generally zones out the Japanese and just pays attention to the English subs, you'll probably at least pick up some random words here or there. And yeah, you'll probably end up with a better ear for Japanese than compared to someone who has never heard Japanese before. So I would just think of it as super low quality passive listening. And so any benefits that come from passive listening, you can expect to get from having watched tons of hours of anime with subs, just in relatively small quantities. So what benefits come with passive listening? Well, yeah, you get better at parsing the sounds. And to the extent that you can hear the sounds, you're going to have better pronunciation in general. And yeah, maybe you even picked up some words. So overall, it's probably not that huge of a leg up. Like maybe you'll end up being like 3 months ahead of somebody who's truly starting from scratch. That's just a random guess. But again, it's hard to say for sure, and also there's individual difference. But yeah, I'd also just say that I've met some people who like think they understand a decent amount of Japanese because they've watched a lot of anime, but if you actually like quiz them, they know like almost nothing, and they're just deluding themselves because they're watching with the subs. But I'm not saying that's what's happening to you. You're not saying that at all. But yeah, I would say that if you've watched over 2,000 hours of anime, but with subs, maybe that comes out to, your listening abilities are like a month or two, maybe 3 months ahead of someone who's totally starting from scratch. That'd be my guess, but again, really hard to quantify with confidence. So Jeremy Gordon asks, I'm just curious what people recommend for passive listening audio extraction. I do a lot of immersion in Netflix, but I'm not sure the best way to get that audio onto my PC. Do you recommend just replaying the audio in Netflix? Yes, there's a lot of different options here. Actually, just yesterday, I did a consultation with somebody who I've been talking to for a while, and they're not that technical as far as this stuff goes. And so they actively immerse on Netflix, and then they keep the Netflix app open on their phone, and they do all their passive listening just through listening to Netflix on their phone. So that's definitely a valid option. That's probably the easiest option. It requires the least amount of technical savvy and just the least amount of time messing around with technology and stuff. So I think that's totally fine. Another option is, you can get some kind of program that will record the audio coming out of your computer. And there's a little discussion in actually the comments of this comment in the Patreon post. But yeah, you can do this with Audacity, where you change the input method from not an actual physical microphone to just the audio that's coming out of your computer. So you can directly record the audio coming out of your computer with like high quality. So you could just keep Audacity open and then hit record while you're watching Netflix, and then at the end you have this actual audio file that you could put onto your phone, and that way you don't have to rely on having a internet connection when you're out and about and passively listening. So that's definitely an option as well. And then the next option is you actually are like downloading the shows and extracting the audio. And the benefit of this is you can create condensed audio files. Now I have a video on this, so I'm not going to go into detail here, but a condensed audio file is basically where it's an audio file that contains only the portions of a show where people are actually talking. And it's made through using the subtitle file, because a subtitle file is really two things. First of all, it's a list of everything that's said in the show, but it's also a list of timings of when people were saying things. So if you have a subtitle file, you can actually easily determine when no one was saying anything, because if there was no sub supposed to be on the screen for that period of time, no one was talking. So a lot of people have created software that lets you just feed in a video file and a subtitle file, and it will export out it will output an audio file that's just only the audio from sections where people are talking. And people have kind of added these tweaks so that if two subtitle lines were close enough to each other or even overlapping, then they just let it play all the way through, so that you don't get a lot of like awkward cuts and things like that. So it ends up, a lot of times these condensed audio files are close to half as long as the original file, which means that you're going to get twice as much exposure to your target language by listening to it. So that's a pretty significant benefit in my opinion. So for me in Chinese, for example, I do all my passive listening through condensed audio files. And I create these condensed audio files myself by downloading the shows and downloading the subtitles and then putting them through a program that someone made, I think called Condenser. There's actually about 3 or 4 different programs that I've seen people have created for making condensed audio files. So I'll put them all in the description of this video, including the one that I use. But yeah, that's the method that I use. But it's a little bit of a pain in the ass because, first of all, you have to download everything, which is a pain in the ass. And then you have to actually figure out how to use the software and put it through the software. And some of the software is not that user-friendly. Now, there is a website that someone in the community made that just hosts pre-created condensed audio. It's available for Japanese and Chinese. For Japanese, I think they have just a lot of anime mostly. And then for Chinese, they have like some dramas and movies, I think. So if you're learning Japanese and you like anime, you can kind of just go to this site that I'll put a link to in the description. And if the guy who made the site has already uploaded the condensed audio for a particular show that you want to watch or have seen, then you can just download that, put it on your phone, and it'll be pretty hassle-free. If you want to do it yourself, then, your 2 real options are you can download from Netflix, which if you have a PC, you can do with a program called FlixGrabs, and then you can use this other a Chrome extension called Subadub to download the subtitle file. That's actually what I've done with a lot of Chinese shows. I just download them from Netflix, and then I put them through the program. Or the other option is you can torrent them. And there's a lot of different torrent sites out there. And there's a pretty popular website called Kitsuneko where you can find Japanese subtitles for anime that kind of match the torrents. Sorry, my voice is kind of running out right now. And so, yeah, for me personally, I do all my immersion locally. I like to download the files and watch them with MPV because, first of all, there's a really good extension for MPV called MPVacious that lets you mine substats or S cards in real time really quickly. So that's how I do all my mining for Chinese. I just like to have it locally, have full control over it. I can rewind in like really small increments, and I don't have to wait for it to rebuffer or anything like that. And so personally, I do all my immersion locally. I always have. But yeah, that takes the kind of technical savvy and work of downloading all the files. That's definitely not for everyone. I'd say for most people, they're probably going to be best off just watching with Netflix and sticking with that. You get 90% of the benefit, and it's really just really easy. Takes no setup. So that's what I'd recommend for most people, but just for transparency's sake, I explained what I personally do as well. So Ian asks, I'm in stage 1 and I found this guide by Tae Kim for grammar. Would you recommend doing the advanced grammar even though I am in stage 1? I think it's funny that this guy worded it as if Tae Kim is this new thing that he discovered on his own, because I've been recommending Tae Kim since the beginning of time. But yeah, I mean, so with regards to the advanced grammar in Tae Kim, I would say just read through it. Can't hurt to read through it, but don't worry about retaining it or anything like that. Just read through it once. Whatever sticks, and whatever doesn't, don't worry about it. So Luki Diadno, I don't know how to pronounce that, asks, do you think people who are already fluent in 2 or more languages have an easier time picking up a new language through immersion? Why or why not? So this depends on a lot of things. So, well, first of all, if you're learning a language that's similar to a language you already know, then it's going to make it a lot easier, right? So if we say a Japanese person learning Italian versus an English speaker learning Italian, the English speaker has a huge advantage. It's going to take them less than half of the time to learn the language. So if you know 2 languages, well, then it's more likely that the third language that you pick up is going to be similar to one of the 2 languages you know. Like, for example, I know English and Japanese, and now I'm learning Chinese. And both Japanese and English help me out, because Japanese lets me know all the characters and a lot of the words and a lot of the pronunciations of words, roughly, and even some of the grammar. And then the base word order of Chinese is the same as English. So then English helps me comprehend some of the grammar on a basic level. So the fact that I know these 2 languages puts me in a better position than someone who only knows Japanese or someone who only knows English. So again, the more languages you already know, the more likely it's going to be that you have a head start when you pick up a new language, because you get to the benefit of the knowledge from all the other languages that you have. So there is that. But if you just mean like in a vacuum, like let's just say hypothetically, you know 2 languages and then you're learning a third language that is completely different than the 2 languages you already know, would you have an advantage over someone who only knows 1 language and they're learning that same language that is also completely different from the language that they know? Well, I would say probably, because I think that just knowing 2 languages kind of helps your brain understand that different languages are a thing and how different languages can be. You know, like I think when I made my video on mentalese, which is kind of just the pure conceptual thought language that we think in, the people who resonated with it the most were people who were already bilingual. Because I think when you're monolingual and you've only been speaking 1 language your whole life, it's hard to really separate your thoughts from the language that you speak, because they can be so intertwined. But when you speak at least 2 different languages, then it's a lot easier to kind of notice the separation between the mentalese and the language. It feels almost impossible not to become aware of this distinction here. And so because of that, already having an understanding of the difference between mentalese and languages, that will probably help you out when you're learning a language. So that's something that, purely from being bilingual, it will help you out. Now, if you're bilingual because you had a native language and then you taught yourself another language through immersion as an adult, then that's also going to give you a leg up, because you'll already understand how the process works. And there's a lot of aspects of the language learning process that you can only learn through firsthand experience and through going through it yourself. And you don't get this from just learning multiple languages as a child. So if you just have like a half Japanese, half American baby who grows up fluent in both languages, he's not necessarily going to be a good language learner, because he's never actually consciously learned a language as an adult. He's never gone through that process and doesn't know anything about it. So that's another thing to take into account. If you've taught yourself a language, then you're going to have a lot of language learning skills that are obviously going to help you out. So yeah, those are all my thoughts with regards to, is being fluent in 2 or more languages going to help you out? So probably yes, and there's all these different subtle ways that it may help you. Alexander Brost asks, Would you recommend taking any preliminary considerations, i.e., a specific grammar study, before starting to learn a very similar language to one you already speak, for example, from Spanish to Italian? Or would it be better to just jump right into immersion? Well, I actually recommend jumping right into immersion no matter what language you're learning. But yeah, I would say this is probably even more so if you're learning a language that's really similar to a language that you're already fluent in. Now, with regards to the question of do you ever want to study grammar? I mean, you probably don't have to, but personally I would slowly study grammar because of course every language has its own quirks and is going to be different, and taking a quick run through the grammar consciously will probably help your comprehension move along even more quickly than it would otherwise. So it's certainly less, it'll probably make less of a difference. If you're talking about trying to learn Japanese, if you're an English speaker, you're trying to learn Japanese without reading any grammar guides, it's definitely possible, but it's going to be really hard and really slow, and learning a grammar guide is going to really help. Whereas if you're talking about, okay, you speak Spanish and you're going to learn Italian, I still think it would help to read a grammar guide, but the amount it's going to help is going to be much less significant than it would in the case of going from English to Japanese. So I'd say, even if you're learning Japanese, start immersing as soon as you can, because that's going to help you improve as quickly as possible. But yeah, if you're going from one language to a very similar one, then put even more emphasis on immersion right from the start. Probably still read through a grammar guide, but kind of de-emphasize it. Just do it on the side and just think of it as, you're taking a quick pass through it to expose yourself to the patterns. And if you really hate grammar, then maybe even skip it altogether, because you won't be missing out on that much. Just if you're the type of person who isn't opposed to reading about grammar, then I would, my intuition is that it would help you enough to be worth it, as long as you didn't spend too much time on it. Joe S. Bank asks, is there an Anki deck you created to learn about Japanese pitch accent? If so, would you consider sharing it? And if not, would you consider creating one? No, I've never created any deck that teaches pitch accent. There will definitely be refold instruction for how to learn pitch accent in the future. But I don't think it's just going to be a deck, because pitch accent isn't just a list of stuff that you memorize. There's a lot of higher level concepts that you need to understand in order to really grasp pitch accent. And I don't think an Anki deck is the best format for teaching people those higher level concepts. So I think something more like a series of videos teaching the higher level concepts combined with an Anki deck for memorizing what you learned in those videos, as well as the pitch accents of individual words, is probably what would be ideal. And Refold will definitely come up with that at some point, but I can't tell you exactly what it will be. But right now, if you want to learn about pitch accent, Dogen's phonetic series is probably the best thing that's out there right now. It's really good. And yeah, you don't really have to go into all the little nitty-gritty details of pitch accent. I would mostly focus on learning the basics and learning to hear the basics really well, because that's what I think is going to make the biggest difference. So Sidma asks, how should we make sentence cards for複合動詞? If you don't know, so複合動詞is basically, in Japanese, there are these verbs that are kind of like two verbs combined. For example, tobikomu means to jump into something. So tobu means to jump, and komu is kind of komu means to be crowded, but when it's combined with another verb, normally it has a bunch of different meanings, but it can mean to do something intensely, to do something fully. And so tobikomu just happens to mean to jump into. Now, with these compound verbs or複合動詞, sometimes if you know the two component parts, then it's obvious what it means as a whole. Other times you could never guess, like kuri dasu or kuri kaesu. I don't it's not a sum of the parts. It's you have part A and part B and you combine it together and it just means something totally different. And I'll also note that there are certain suffixes, there are certain verbs that when they come on the end of a複合動詞, they always mean something different than if it's just used in isolation. For example, dasu. Dasu, normally it means to take out, I could say I'm going to dasu my phone from my bag. It means I'm going to take out my phone from my bag. But when it's used in the end of a compound verb, it means, well, it actually has a couple different meanings, but the most common meaning is to start doing X. So, for example, if you had like yomidasu, it means to start reading. Yomu means to read. And then also you could say yomi hajimeru. That also means to start reading, but the nuance is different between those two. But it's a subtle difference that'd be hard to explain in English. So that's just some background on what Fukugo Doshi are for anyone who is learning Japanese but isn't far enough along to otherwise follow the rest of the question. Hopefully now this question will benefit you. So if you don't know both of the words inside of the Fukugo Doshi, I'm not even sure it should be considered a 1T card. Though at the same time, there are a lot of Fukugo Doshi that use words that are rarely seen outside of the Fukugo Doshi. Do you recommend that we learn the definition of the Fukugo Doshi but also the definitions of the two words, or the one or the one that you don't already know if you already know one of them? Should we skip it if we don't know the words inside it? Fukugo Doshi was the most annoying words to learn when I was still a beginner. Now that I'm better at Japanese, it's not as annoying as it used to, but I'd still like to know your opinion. So, in my opinion, you should just, as a general principle, it's probably, well, so first of all, I would break down Fukugo Doshi into largely two categories: set phrases and ones that are getting created on the spot. So, for example, there are certain suffixes that you can add to any, like certain suffix verbs that you can add to any verb and make up a new Fukugo Doshi right on the spot. So hajimeru is one of those. You can take any verb, put it in nenyoke, and then add hajimeru, and it will mean to start doing that verb. Like yari hajimeru or yomi hajimeru. And so if you look up like some random verb plus hajimeru, like what you say yomi hajimeru, which means to start reading, it's not going to be in the dictionary because that's not really a set compound verb. It's just a compound verb that someone made up on the spot. So for things like that, I mean, there's the problem of can you tell if it's this or not? But if it's this case, then you don't want to even think of it as a compound verb or a Fukugo Doshi. I just think of it as A plus B. In this case, yomu plus hajimeru. And the best litmus test for judging whether this is the case or not is look the word up in the dictionary. If you look up the compound word in the dictionary and there's an entry for it, then it probably means it's a set phrase, and I'll talk about that next. If there's no entry for it, that probably means it's just A plus B, and in that case, treat them as two separate verbs. And if you're treating them as two separate verbs and you know one of them but not the other, then it's going to be 1T. If you don't know either of them, then it's not going to be, then it's going to be 2T. And if you know both of them, if you know both of them already, then it should be 0T, theoretically, right? And so you don't need to make a card for it either way. So in this case, you wouldn't make a card for it if it was 2T. You would if it was 1T, not if it's 0T. So that's that. And then there's the case where it's a set phrase. So for example, kuridasu, kurikaesu. These are the ones where it's a set phrase and you can't necessarily determine what the compound as a whole means just by knowing the component parts. So for these, I would just treat it as a single verb. I wouldn't even think of it as two things combined. I would just think of it as it's one unit. Like kuri kaesu, there's literally no point in thinking of it as kuru plus kaesu. It's just kuri kaesu is one unit, has one thing. Or like kuridasu is like another one like that. See if I can think of something else. But yeah, or even tobikomu, I would think of as like, it's just a set phrase. And like there's different types. There's set phrases where if you know the two component parts, you can like see why it means what it means, but that's only like hindsight bias. Like if you didn't already have the answer, you could think of like 4 different things that it means, but in reality, it only means one of those 4 possibilities. And then there's other ones like kurikaisu when it's just like makes no sense at all. So, well, I mean, it makes some sense, but you know, it's like pretty far-fetched. You probably couldn't guess it. So yeah, in those cases, and everything in the second category of set phrases, I would just treat it as a single word. Don't even worry about learning the two component parts, but do look out for words that take on a different meaning when they're used as a suffix. Like komu would be one of these, dasu is one of these. And you don't necessarily have to learn them as a separate thing, but just over time, like I think for me, I never explicitly learned komu as a suffix in a compound. But over time, you just slowly get an intuition. You learn so many like something komu compound verbs that you just start to get an intuition for what it means. And then when you come across a new word that is something komu, you can kind of guess what it means and you're probably right. So that's probably the best way to handle those recurring, because like there's certain things where like once you get it, it's obvious. Like once you get what komu means in like tobi komu, it's obvious. But before you get it, it's like doesn't make any sense. And if you read an explanation, it doesn't make any sense. So for those type of things where it's just like you kind of have to wait till it just clicks naturally, and reading explanations just makes you more confused, I'd say don't worry about how the verb is breaking down. Just memorize the whole verb as a single unit, and over time you'll naturally get a sense for how the different parts work. So yeah, just to summarize, first of all, try to determine whether it's a set phrase or not, and you can do this by looking it up in the dictionary. If it's not in the dictionary, then it probably just means it's something that's getting created on the spot, in which case it is A plus B. And in that case, if you know both parts already, then theoretically you should already understand it. If you know one but not the other, it's I plus 1 or 1T. And if you don't know either of them, then it's probably 2T or more. Well, 2T. And if it is in the dictionary, then that means that it's a set phrase, in which case just memorize the whole thing as a single unit and don't worry about the breakdown. So Robert asks, I find myself subconsciously coming up with mnemonics for kanji readings, like otona is pronounced otona. Works a little better when you're reading the question. One of them's kanji, one of them's kana. I had trouble remembering it. Then I started thinking it sounds like tuna. Adults eat tuna. Now I think of that when I see the word. Is this a bad habit? Should I try to avoid associating mnemonics with readings? I'd say it's totally fine to come up with mnemonics if it helps you. The better you get at Japanese, the less you're going to need to do this, because once you build a strong foundation in Japanese, memorizing readings becomes really easy and effortless. It's like you just look at the reading once and then you got it. Maybe you forget it once or twice later on down the line, but for the most part, it gets more sticky and less slippery the better you get at Japanese. And so if you're still starting off and memorizing kanji readings is difficult, then I'd say using mnemonics is totally fine if it helps you. But over time, you probably want to let the mnemonics fade, so that like you don't want to be like totally fluent in Japanese and you see otona and you're thinking of tuna, because the word otona has absolutely nothing to do with tuna. But I would say as long as you let them fade over time, which should happen naturally as you get more exposure to Japanese, then it's totally fine if it helps you learn the readings. So yeah. Katie Woodhams asks, I've heard you say a few times that over the course of learning Japanese, you learned how to use your attention effectively. Would you be able to talk more about what it looks like to use your attention effectively while listening or reading? I'm in about stage 2C and usually listening or reading to stuff where I have about level 4 comprehension, with the odd thing at level 3 or 5. So yeah, we actually wrote a whole article about this in stage 3. If you go to stage 3C, building speaking competence, it's basically a list of things that you want to pay attention to. So basically the idea is that there's a lot of subtle aspects of language that you don't necessarily need to be paying attention to learn to understand, but you might not just pick them up naturally if you don't intentionally stay on the lookout for them. So one of these things is like the exact way that natives use fillers. A lot of times, like my experience with Japanese was when I first went to start speaking Japanese, I found myself naturally using fillers, but I had this sense of like, wait, am I using these correctly? Like, what fillers do Japanese people use the most? Like, I know what fillers there are, but I don't have a good sense of how often which one is used. Is there a difference in the way that the different fillers are used? And I didn't have a good sense for that, because over the course of getting fluent in Japanese, my brain just started filtering out fillers pretty much, right? Because there's no neat reason to really pay attention to them, except if you're trying to improve your speaking. And so one of the things that you can do if you realize, I don't really know exactly how fillers work, is you can start paying attention to fillers specifically whenever you're immersing, and kind of take mental notes or just observe, just learn through observation how using fillers works, and then you'll be able to do that yourself. So if you go to that article, build speaking competence, it's a whole list of things that are like fillers that, for some of them you might have just totally picked up spontaneously, which is great, but a lot of them you probably will find that you didn't pick up spontaneously, so you need to kind of be on the lookout for those things in your immersion. So what I would recommend doing is like first read through that article, and then pick a couple things that you feel like you want to work on, and then just maybe even write those down on a sticky note and put it on the side of your monitor, and then just keep those things in mind as you're immersing, and try to be on the lookout for those things so that you can observe them, absorb more, and then become able to use them yourself. But I probably wouldn't really worry about this until you have stage 5 comprehension consistently. If you're still at stage 4 mostly, then I'd say use all your mental resources on comprehension. This whole next level of like using your attention effectively, it really is talking about like, okay, once you have comprehension down, how do you go to the next level, which is like absorbing as much of it as possible so that you can use it yourself. So yeah, if you're at level 4 or below in a certain domain, then I'd say then using your attention just comes down to, I think there's kind of like this spectrum between how intensely you're paying attention. On one hand, you're completely zoning out. On the other end of the spectrum, you're like so intently focusing that you almost like lose the big picture. You know, you're getting like sucked into one little aspect of like, maybe you're just listening to the pronunciation so intensely that you don't even follow what's being said. So I think there's kind of a sweet spot around the middle of the spectrum where, you know, you're relaxed, you have a kind of panoramic style of attention, but you're also focused and you know, your mind's not wandering. And I think this is probably the best mental state to be in for growing your comprehension. It's kind of this balance between paying attention in kind of hyper focused sort of way, and then just zoning out. And so I think through experimentation, you can kind of find the sweet spot. So that's what I'd say using your attention effectively means for growing your comprehension. Whereas once you have level 4 or above, yeah, then it gets to the stage 3 stuff of actually having something that you consciously are on the lookout for to absorb and improve your output. So Andy asks, how do you go about learning common words like kakolgan, in which the definition has a bunch of scientific words? You wouldn't make cards for uncommon scientific words in the definition, like karichoseki, shachoseki, shironmo, etc., right? So yeah, this is the word he asked about, kakolgan, means granite. And so I'd say for words like these, where there's just a one-to-one correlation between English and Japanese, just learn it bilingually. And I think for, like, actually, I talked about this in the MIA site. We didn't actually go into as much detail on it in the Refold site. But basically, of course, for most words in the language, there's no true equivalent between languages, right? Like in Japanese, if you take any verb, there's no true equivalent between a Japanese verb and an English verb. Like hashiru doesn't mean to run. Aruku doesn't mean to walk. They're close, but subtly different. But if you take scientific terms in particular, they literally have a specific definition that exists within the context of all the other scientific terms, and it doesn't change. Like hydrogen has a very particular definition, and it always means exactly the same thing. It doesn't slowly shift over time due to, you know, the current zeitgeist. Hydrogen always means the same thing. And so for words like these scientific words, they literally are identical across languages. Like the Japanese word for hydrogen means literally the same thing as the English word for hydrogen. And so granite, this is actually, like, you could say it's a scientific term because it's the term for a particular type of matter. And so it's going to be exactly the same in different languages. Now, there might be nuances associated with granite that are different in different languages. Like maybe granite is considered to be really beautiful in one language and really ugly in another language. But the definition isn't going to tell you that anyway. Like the monolingual definition isn't going to tell you that. It's just going to have a bunch of scientific words. So I would say in cases like this where it's a noun that has such a defined meaning that it's going to be the same regardless of what culture you're in or what language you're in, just learn it bilingually. And in fact, it's not just easier to learn the word, but you probably want to know like that kakolgan equals granite. You don't want to like know, okay, kakolgan, it's some type of thing in the earth that has this particular scientific definition, and then you in English land, you know that granite is this other material, but you don't know that the two are the same. Like that wouldn't be ideal, right? Because then if you ever have to translate, or you know you're ever learning about something in both Japanese and English, your model of the world won't be converging on the same like common reality. So for these types of nouns and scientific terminology, you actually want to like have A equals B in your mind. Like you want to have like granite equals kakolgan, so that whenever you learn about granite in either language, you're actually improving your knowledge of granite in both languages. And it's all connecting together. So I'd say not only is it easier to learn that word that way, but you actually really want to go out of your way to make the A equals B connection between those nouns. But it is only for common like nouns that have consistent definitions. And personally, I would still put the monolingual definition for it as well on the back of your card, just don't worry about actually understanding it. Just it's almost there for show. I just like to do that just for fun, but realistically, it doesn't matter that much. So yeah, those are all the questions that I put down for this week. Yeah, I mean, I might have said this in the last one as well, but there's less patrons on the Patreon right now than there were for the MI Patreon a couple weeks ago. So the the questions are less crowded. So if you have a question that you're thinking about asking, but you're hesitant, go ahead and ask it, and also make sure to vote them up because, yeah, like I think I did all the questions that have at least one upvote. For the ones that have no upvotes, it's like I really don't know if anyone cares about them besides the person who asked. So, I mean, now I'm almost thinking maybe I should have even done some of those questions. So maybe next time I will as well because I'm only at 45 minutes. But yeah, ask away and vote away as well. So yeah, thanks so much for listening all the way through and for supporting Refill. So I'll catch you guys in the next one.